Welcome to this rapid revision lesson on the King's Peace in Anglo Saxon society. This is the first in a new series on crime and punishment through time, and in this lesson we'll be looking at the basics of how Anglo Saxon society was organised and what the King's role was in both setting and keeping the law. So let's get into it. From kingdoms to earldoms. After the fall of the Roman Empire, various tribes of Angles, Saxons and Jutes invaded, and over the centuries several kingdoms formed. These were the basis for the earldoms on which Saxon government relied. North of the Danelaw, the customs, traditions, taxes and laws and language were more influenced by Norse or Viking culture. In around 1000, the population of England was about 1.7 to 2 million people. 90% of them lived in small, isolated communities. And it's those small, isolated rural communities that we're going to turn our attention to first. Most English towns today have Saxon names, for example with the suffix tun, and these would represent a fairly isolated homestead or farm. An area supporting around 10 households was called a tithing, and a local area of 10 tithings was called a hundred. These were vulnerable to war, raids, storms and bad harvests. They were tight-knit by marriage and family, and collective responsibility was really important for keeping order. Each local area or shire would have a shire reeve in charge of enforcing the king's laws, and other reeves made decisions at a more local level. So let's consider that then. Some of these words still appear in the English language today. Shire is another word for county even now. Think about some of the names of counties in England. Yorkshire, Worcestershire, for example. A shire reeve is where we get the modern word sheriff. All right, we are talking slightly like the Wild West here, in the sense that this is someone who might ride up on their horse and try and keep law and order, but they were appointed by the king, and so they had a very official and a very legitimate role. Although 90% of people did live in the countryside, there were some principal towns, and by the year 1000 some towns were growing, such as Hanwich, which we today call Southampton, on the Channel coast. This was and remains a really important port. Erfeldwich, or York in the north. This was originally a Viking city and a Roman one before that. And Londonwich, or London in the southeast. Not yet always seen as the capital city, but an important power base. These towns were vulnerable to crimes as they were the centres of trade, and that made it more easy to steal. Quite simply, there were more things there to steal. Also, fewer people knew each other, and others came and went regularly, making it easier to get away with crimes. So you might turn up in a town, commit some sort of crime, and go before anyone was able to detect you, and witnesses might not recognise you in the first place. And so, on the whole, the community responsibility in rural areas was more effective at preventing crime, as well as identifying who the criminals were. But there's a third strand to Anglo-Saxon society, which has got relevance to crime and punishment. That third strand is the abbeys and monasteries, belonging to the church. Abbeys and monasteries were communities of monks and nuns. They were spread throughout the country from Lindisfarne in the far north to Whitby near York and Canterbury in the southeast. The church was very powerful and abbeys were often wealthy. Church courts could punish crimes against the church, for example stealing church property or funds. But they also had a role in judging the moral crimes such as sex outside marriage and religious heresy. They also had a role in judging innocence or guilt, which we'll return to in a future lesson when we look at the ways that people were judged in Anglo-Saxon England. Anglo-Saxon society was hierarchical. This meant that it was organised by levels of differing power. So let's have a look at those different levels now. At the top was the king, beneath them the earls, then thanes or nobles, then churls or the so-called yeomen or free farmers, then peasants or serfs, and then right at the bottom, slaves. So what was the role of each of these in keeping law and order? Well, first and most importantly, there was the king. The king was responsible for keeping the so-called King's Peace, allowing people to basically get on with their lives in relative safety. As part of this, they made new laws and they issued codes of law, which might look at and refine earlier laws, for example. Then there were the earls. They advised the king on the new laws. They also appointed the shire reeves responsible for law in their earldom. Then there were the thanes. These were the warrior class of the nobility. Shire reeves were often thanes, but not always, and they only represented about 1% of the population. Then there were the churls, or the yeoman farmers. These were minor landowners or tenants, but they had no role in making the law, even though they represented 10% of the population. Predictably enough, the unfree peasants or serfs, they had to live and work on their lord's land, and they also had no role in making the law, despite the fact that they made up 70% of the population. And of course, right down the bottom were the slaves. Enslaved people were considered legally property. They had no rights. They had no say in the law, even though they represented 10% of the population. So whereas the king might appoint some shire reeves, an awful lot of the time they would delegate this or leave this to the earls. So it's really only these very top levels of society that had a role in both setting and enforcing the law. For the king, this involved codes of law, and that's what we're going to have a look at next. The king was responsible for setting codes of law. Crimes against the social order or hierarchy that we've just looked at were treated very harshly. For example, a serf fighting with his lord was treated much more harshly than a serf fighting with another serf. The most serious expression of this was the crime of treason. A crime against the king, such as helping England's enemies or seeking to kill or replace him, was considered treason. The nobility, such as influential thanes and earls, could advise the king, and that meant that they could back laws that benefited them, and so they rarely benefited the poor. As the Saxon period went on, the power of the king increased, and it became accepted that he could make laws that applied to the whole country. Providing stability through laws, taxation and defence was called the king's peace, and it basically allowed people to get on with their lives feeling like they were being protected. Kings could also issue codes of law. These might introduce new laws, strengthen existing ones if they were being ineffective or being ignored, or they might modify old laws. And we're going to have a look at an example of codes of law now. Being seen to be fair and just was important to keeping a king's legitimacy with his people. That meant that he couldn't always rely on treating each case on a case-by-case basis, making a different judgment in similar cases. And so codes of law were often written down, and therefore a sign that they were agreed upon. One of these actually still exists, in fact several do, but the most important one that we're going to be looking at today is something called the Rochester Codex. Here is the first page from it, and here is the Old English. As it quite clearly says, "This sindon va domas va Ethelbert Kuning, asset on Augustinus Dea, Godes fea churchen to..." Okay, right, you don't get Old English, nor do I really, but it's a fascinating language, and actually if you look closely, modern English is sort of hidden in amongst there. So here is a modern translation, and these are only sections from it. This is a massively long document with lots of laws. This is what it says. "These are the judgments which King Ethelbert set down on Augustine's day. God's property in the churches, one should make good with a 12-fold compensation." In other words, if you stole £1 from them, you would owe them £12 in compensation. But then it applied to other things as well, including what the king's own followers might do. Further down the page it says, "If the king is drinking at someone's home and one does anything corrupt there, one should pay double restitution." So in other words, whatever wrong they do, they should pay double what would make up for it. If a free man, that would be a yeoman or churl, steals from the king, he should make good with a 9-fold compensation. So steal 1 shilling, you owe 9 shillings. Then more serious things as well. If one slays someone in the king's house, one should pay 50 shillings, which would be a huge amount of money. If one lies with one of the king's maidens, one should pay 50 shillings. So here you can see that basically defeating the honour of one of the king's women was considered just as damaging as killing someone within the household. And this gives us an interesting insight into some of the priorities of Anglo-Saxon people. The point for us, though, is that this is written down, and that means that it could be applied equally and consistently across society, with different rules for example, freemen and the king's followers, and indeed the church. But it was agreed, and this was a good way of a king like Ethelbert in this case, showing that he was fair and consistent in his application of the law, and of keeping the king's peace. Let's have a look at our final points. To sum up then, Anglo-Saxon England was divided into earldoms, shires, hundreds and tithings. In about the year 1000, the population was 1.7 to 2 million people. Rural communities were isolated and largely relied on collective responsibility to both find and deal with criminals. Shire reeves or sheriffs administered the law in the shire. Towns had more opportunities for criminal activities, but there weren't very many of them. The church had a role in judging moral crimes, including at monasteries and abbeys. But it was the king who set out the law, and he kept what was known as the king's peace, with the nobility to advise him. However, the majority of people, 90% plus, had no say whatsoever in the law. Codes of law introduced new laws or modified or strengthened existing ones. And that is how the law was organised in England. In a moment, I'm going to do a little bit more on the Rochester Codex, but you can consider that a bit of a bonus if you're interested in hearing some Old English. If not, that's the end of the rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if you have enjoyed it and found it useful, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It'll really help it grow and help other people see what's going on. There'll be more videos in this series coming in the following weeks, so it's well worth your time. Thanks again for watching, and unless you'd like to hear some more Old English, that's all. Goodbye. As a bit of a bonus, let's have a deeper look at the Rochester Codex. We'll be returning to this important source in future videos, particularly when we're looking at the concept of weregild and Anglo Saxon compensation. Here's the Old English, and here is the modern translation. I'll attempt to read it to the best of my ability, though I do admit I don't know the numbers, so I'm going to stick to modern English for those. Wish me luck. This Sindon the Domas the Athelbert Kuning Aset on Augustinus Dea. Godesfeo, Churchen 12 gilder, Bischopsfeo 11 gilder. If Kuning at mannes ham drinketh, or a man leswas what ye do, twibote ye better. If freeman Kuning a stela, 9 gilder for gilder. If in Kunings a tun man mannen of slayer, 50 shillinger. If man with Kunings a maiden man, ye lieth, 50 shillinger ye better. All right, I hope you enjoyed that little bonus. All the best, and really now, goodbye.